Hello, today's Tuesday tip is how to cut bias binding. First of all, you need to know, I'm going to do two methods, but first of all, it's good to know what the bias is. When you buy fabric from a shop, normally you buy fabric on the bolt, okay, and it's sort of like this, all rolled up, okay, and you will ask for, say, 1/2 metre of fabric. So let's say that's 1/2 metre, it's not far off to be honest. And this is the lengthwise grain. So as it comes off the bolt, this is the lengthwise grain. And then the crosswise grain goes from the selvage over and up and back over to the other selvage. So it's across the way. The selvage is the sort of stiffer part of the fabric that's been there to hold the fabric in place while it's been produced. So you've got the lengthwise and the crosswise grain. The bias grain goes diagonally across, and it's much more unstable and it's much more stretchy. So these grains, if I cut a strip here or a strip across here, they wouldn't stretch, they'd be quite rigid for woven fabric. If I cut it across the bias, it will be really stretchy, and that's why it's so great for going around corners, because it doesn't bunch up. So for things like piping and binding, cutting things on the bias is ideal, and actually it's really easy. So as I said, I'm going to show you two methods. The first method is using a board and a cutting board and a ruler, okay, and a ruler with a 45 degrees. So method one, you would open out your fabric, and what you would do is your board will have a 45, most boards will have a 45 degree line on it. So you could put your fabric on, okay, line it up, line your fabric up one of the straighter edges, so probably the selvage edge, line that up with one of your vertical lines, and then you can see I've got my 45 degree line here, 45 degree line there, and I could just cut that. When I do my bias, I only need to cut one bias strip, so you could do it like that. How I tend to do it is cut it exactly the same in terms of lining it up. So I line up an edge on one of the vertical lines. Let's just pull this down a bit so you can see a bit better. Okay, line it up on a vertical line. And then it doesn't actually matter. My 45 degree line is here. Hopefully you can see that. I'll just put some tape on it so you can see as I cut. So my cutting is a bit wonky, and sometimes you will get wonky cuts. So as long as you've got your one of your edges lined up, so your selvage edge lined up against one of the vertical lines, then I can take any of these horizontal lines and line up my ruler. Okay, now where I line it up, like how big this triangle is going to be, really depends on how. This is going to be the smallest of my bias strips, so I don't want it tiny, be cutting loads. I don't want it huge because then I'll be wasting some. So it's a bit of a judgment call. I would normally do it about there. Okay, and I'm going to do one bias cut. So in this method, you do one bias cut either using the board or using your ruler. I'm going to use that scrap later. Then turn your fabric around. I find it so much easier to do it like this. Okay, and what I want to show you now is just how easy it is to cut off your bias strips, but also then how to fold the fabric so you can do it really quickly. Okay, so when I cut my strips are normally somewhere between 2 and 1.5. Really depends on the project that I'm doing. Okay, so smaller projects I probably go for the 1.5, larger projects 2. Also depends on the type of binding I'm making, but we'll talk about that next week. So I'm going to use my 1.5 line here. I'm going to cut 1.5 inch strips, and just so you can see that easier, I'll move this down to here. Okay, so 1.5 inch strips, and now can you see I'm just going to, I've only got one bias cut, but then I can just cut everything from there. So 1.5, line up. Flipping that fabric round to begin with is really quite important. Okay, so I've got my first two bias strips really nice and spongy. but now I'm too big for the board, the fabric's too big for the board. Okay, so all you need to do now is you fold the fabric up, but you fold it up, make sure that bias edge is matching. Okay, so it's worth taking a moment just to fiddle with your fabric and make it all nice and flat. And then after that, once you've got there, look how quick it is just to cut some more strips. Okay. So it is really super quick. Okay. And then if again in a moment my fabric gets too big for the board, I would just fold it again. Yeah. Always fold it up so that you're folding, if I was folding, I'd fold up against that bias, the edge I'm cutting. Okay. So that's method 2, method 1 even. Method 2 is simpler. You don't need any rulers or boards or anything really. You cut yourself a square. Now the amount of fabric you need for either in the square or for the method 1 binding, there's a document attached to this that shows you the calculations. Okay. For this method, method 2, you're going to just cut a square and then cut it across on the diagonal. Okay. I've used a rotary cutter, but you could easily use scissors. Just draw a line and use scissors. Then you're going to join it. So this was my original square. I'm going to move this over here, and I want to join these two together. So I would do right sides together. Okay, and I would end up with a piece of fabric that looked like that. But happily, I have done this. Okay, so I've taken the fabric from over here and joined it. So here's my piece of fabric, 1/4 inch seam. Okay, now this is my bias cut. Okay, across the way. Normally it will be the longest side that you're using. So I turn it round. All I've done is I've drawn on here my 1.5. So 1.5 draw, 1.5 draw. But again, you don't need a big ruler. You can use you could use just a normal everyday school ruler to do this. Okay, and then you don't need to use a rotary cutter. You could just use scissors here to cut out. Okay, and then this will give you your bias strip. Okay, obviously I'm going to get 4 out of here. 1, 2, 3, 4. This one's going to be scrap. Okay, and then again I've got a nice bias strip. So next week on the Tuesday tip, we'll look at how to join these strips together, and then what are your options on preparing the binding and applying it, preparing the binding to apply to the edge of your projects.